Thanks, Christian. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Really excited to have you all here. Whereas, as it said at the top, we're going to talk a little bit about a launch event coming September 10th through 12th in Dallas for our technology and service provider audiences. You'll hear more about that. But more importantly, we've got Abhishek and Ronak on the next slide to talk about a few key discussion points for today. First, Abhishek will talk a little bit about some of the opportunities for counteracting permacrisis and globalization and things of that nature. We'll also talk about the mindsets, tool sets, and skill sets that we will help you on your growth journey for at Elevate in Dallas later in the year. Ronak will lead with 5 forces shaping the growth for technology in the tech services industry. We're going to tease you a little bit with some opportunities for shaping and winning deals. And as the moderator said, we'll take your questions at the end, do a little bit of Q&A. Also, please do submit your questions during any time during this webinar. With that, let me turn it over to Abhishek for our first discussion point.
Thank you, Mark. Let's move to the next slide. Oh, yes, there we are. So let's start right at the very beginning. I mean, set the context for why we are doing this conference and why some of the issues that we are going to talk about and how they sit in context to what's really happening across the world. So let's look at some of the micro dynamics shaping enterprise growth bets as we speak of the remainder of the year and 2026. So there are 4 big themes to keep in mind. First, geopolitics, regulation, and supply chains. I'm pretty sure you are hearing about it a lot as you listen to mainstream media. Export controls are squeezing hardware margins. EU AI Act in itself is further tightening compliance expectations a lot, much more beyond what we have already seen. And cross-border data rules are kind of pulling apart across regions, creating more complexity. That's actually making harder for businesses to scale globally. So that's the context in which we are operating in this year. The second major macro dynamic is growth in talent. Interest rates are still high. Budgets are moving more towards Gen AI and cybersecurity is what we are seeing. And even with layoffs happening, which you are pretty much aware of, and you can see some of the data points that are mentioned on this slide, AI talent still remains in high demand. So there's a kind of an ironical dichotomy playing out here. Third big microdynamic here is the AI-led innovation, which is really picking up speed. Agentic AI is expanding the market, but it's also raising new concerns, as would be natural, around IP protection, whether it is around infrastructure access, whether it is about data control. Last but not the least is this question about some of the enterprise postures which appear to be shifting. Take, for example, ESG. With the ESG momentum slowing, the focus is back on resilience. That means more attention on automation, cybersecurity, and operational continuity. At this point, you might be asking this question, what's really happening here? My quick take, these aren't disparate themes. These are all linked. Together, they are shaping a significant inflection point in the industry. And yet, as we speak of an inflection point, this is not the first time in the history of this industry that there has been an inflection point. So to unpack that history and read about some of the S-curves that have brought us here, I'll be handing it over to Ronak. He'll be walking us through the phases of changes that have shaped the global technology and services industry in the past. Ronak, over to you.
Yeah, now again, let's look at I think the S-curves on this slide, right, which is very interesting because with every inflection points or major shift that you were talking about, we have seen a new S-curve. And what's been interesting is if you look at the history of these S-curves, right, the first one was all about building the first generation of reliable infrastructure, enabling the first generation of digital workflows, right? A lot of these companies that are out there, they're not in the same shape and form today, right? So that's been the 1980s. infrastructure and connectivity era that we saw. And then from there, when we moved to the early 2000 post Y2K, it was all about global delivery, remote infrastructure management, setting up the big systems of records across supply chain management, manufacturing execution systems, and ERPs. That is what dominated bulk of our early 2000s, post the and again then post the financial crisis. We saw this wave of software driving data centers, software driving networks, software driving all kind of different technology themes that we saw. So all software defined operations became the big theme, and definitely underpinning them was this new thing about cloud, right? The ability to provision infrastructure, get access to data and AI technologies at the click of a button, and the speed at which we were moving, right? So if I look at the 1980s eras, where it would take months or years to provision infrastructure, to being able to do it in a few seconds or minutes in the 2010s and 20 eras, is amazing in terms of how the technology and services industry has evolved. And now, as I kind of, Abhishek, I heard you talk about all of these different macro themes that are coming together and impacting us. Definitely the big one that we want to talk about today is, hey, how are these systems evolving to become AI powered or intelligence powered, where they have the agency to act, to execute, and how they are becoming systems of execution and driving the next phase of transformation. What's interesting for me is, as I've studied this as an analyst, but also as a student of the industry for so many years, one thing I've seen is the firms that operate in a particular S curve, the providers, right, the technology and services providers, they, as they move from one S curve to the other, they either perish or they evolve into something else. And I think that's the evolution that we're starting to see at the start of this new S curve, which makes me very excited about who will be the winners, how will this shape up the industry, and there's so many other questions that all of us have. And I think that's what we want to explore today, but also at Elevate in Dallas, right? So that's going to be very interesting. So if you look at the next slide, right, and I wanted to kind of bring some data out here, right, because I think, Abhishek, as you mentioned, the macro shifts and AI innovation race, we asked a bunch of our customers at the in early April and said, hey, what are you seeing in terms of budgets, right? Because where are you investing in? And it was no surprise. The overall sentiment is that we want to increase our budgets when it comes to AI, generative AI. We want to invest into infrastructure, compute, that drives large transformation. So modernizing our systems, driving these large transformation aims are there. Yes, we want to do this at a higher productivity and velocity. So we are looking at how can we reduce the amount of headcount and still drive more or same transformation themes out there. So that is where the challenge is going to be for this industry. Is one of the definition of this new S curve that is coming out here is, hey, how do we look at unlocking significant amount of productivity? How do we use the levers of AI and drive this change at the speed that we are all talking about out here? And if you move to the next slide, this is where we started to kind of also talk about the overall connectedness of the organization, right? Because at one end, I think, Abhishek, you mentioned about the pharma crisis or the consistent uncertainty that we have seen and all the macro forces shaping up. But at the same time, we've also seen the globalization becoming somewhat slower or going backwards. So we were using the word globalization. So the combination of both of this kind of made us reflect on supply chains as a whole. So one thing that we do see is the models, which is providers, specifically in the services industry, be it IT, engineering, BPO, that is not going to go away, right? That's still critical for everyone. The other piece that we also see is the offshoring model, looking at global delivery model, the setups in global capability centers or GCCs, those are not going to go away. And the last but not the least is, yes, some of the physical supply chains will get reshored. You will see some of that coming onshore, which is good because it creates jobs, it creates more innovation, and it drives change. But a lot of that is going to be through the power of AI and agentic AI, right? So that's how we are seeing all of these uncertainty kind of transforming in terms of the demand themes and also the S curve shift that we see. But Abhishek, I had a question for you. So as you look at the next 12 months, what is our research telling us in terms of industries, geographies, and services segments? Where is going to be the growth? Where is going to be the challenge? What do you see?
Yeah, I have taken a shot at that, and let's move to the next slide to discuss exactly this question. And this is kind of a busy slide with a lot of text on it, but I'm pretty sure as you look through it, you are able to make out what it's really saying. This slide gives us a directional view of where enterprise tech and services spend is gaining momentum and where it's slowing down. What we have done here is categorized industries, geographies, and enterprise functions into 3 segments: leaders, middlers, and laggards. You'll notice there is strong momentum in regulated, innovation-driven sectors like capital markets, healthcare, and life sciences. Geographies like Japan, India, and Southeast Asia appear to be standing out for investment activity. And at the same time, what you'll notice is that functions which are tied to AI, data, operations, and cybersecurity are clearly where spending is consolidating or increasing. As you look at this slide, here are the questions that you should be asking yourself. Question number 1, is growth happening in regulated industries versus less regulated industries? Second question, is growth happening in AI first sectors or in those that are still focused or are impaired with legacy technologies or continuing with it? Third question could be, how should your sales, marketing, or solution strategy change depending on where a customer sits in this matrix? While we will return to these questions in rest of the webinar, do remember this. We will be addressing these very questions in greater detail at Elevate. So lock in the date, September 10th to 12th at Dallas, where we will be going into greater detail in trying to unpack how this plays out. And since we are already on this topic of growth, what I'd like to do at this juncture is take a test of how good you are at crystal ball gazing. Let's move to the next slide and launch a poll. So with calendar year 2024 growth at 1.7%, what does this group expect the CY 2025 growth to be? More than 10%, 5 to 10%, 2 to 5%, 0 to 2%, or do you think it'll be in the negative zone? Mark, what is your bet? Where is the group going to land at?
I'll be interested to see where the growth lands at. But as you teed up pretty nicely, Abhishek, the purpose and focus of Elevate is to move the growth needle up for all of our tech and service providers joining. And we will share a little bit more about it while people are responding. It's good to see the results coming in here. Our focus is when we drive collective growth for all of our tech and service provider attendees to the benefit of their buyers, everyone wins. Okay. Interesting to see these results.
Okay, let's end the poll and see the results. Very much in the ballpark, Ronak, would you say, in the way we have kind of been projecting?
Yeah.
But yeah, so this is an optimistic group, much more optimistic than what we generally see. So good to have you folks here because we'll continue to lean in on those themes that will drive greater growth and help you with tools and methodologies that help you drive it and create more traction in the market. So let's move on from here. Let's take a look at what we are going to cover next. And this is where we tee up the topic of the day, where Mark will get the limelight to talk about how we are going to engage with you at Elevate 2025 in Dallas. What we are bringing here are mindsets, skill sets, and tool sets for growth. And that is what Mark will be talking about in this section. So Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Abhishek. And as Abhishek just said, on the right side of the slide, mindsets, skill sets, tool sets for growth. Those of you attending this webinar that are focused on driving value for your customers and your partners in the ecosystem, this Elevate conference is for you. We have other conferences in our portfolio that are targeted for our buy-side attendees. But we have built this conference specifically to provide all growth responsible leaders, whether you carry a sales title, a product strategy title, a partner ecosystem title. We have an opportunity through the proprietary insight and research that we have, a little bit Abhishek and Ronak previewed in some of the earlier slides. They're going to drill in a little bit further in some of their later slides. Our focus is providing all growth responsible leaders across technology and service provider organizations the tools to be more predictive, more scalable, and more collective in driving your growth. The concept of better together. Your customers, they buy outcomes, they buy ecosystems, they buy platform-based solutions. Elevate is about creating the opportunity for bringing those perspectives together. So from a mindset and skill set and tool set perspective, you've come to expect that from Everest Group. For those of you that are customers, you've come to expect that from us in everything that we do. The conference itself, September 10th through 12th, at the Renaissance Dallas Hotel in Dallas, Texas, will bring all of this to light. On the next slide, like to share a little bit about who has helped us build this conference and where the sources of input come from. So Ronak and Abhishek, as subject matter experts in various pieces of the growth ecosystem, certainly can bring the Everest Group perspective to the table. But we have also built an advisory board and a list of external speakers, along with our Everest Group analysts, that ensure that the content is focused on what really will move the needle for growth. With that sort of lukewarm perspective on our poll results of what calendar year 2025 growth could look like, the purpose of this agenda and the feedback from the esteemed platform of advisory board leaders you see here is to really meaningfully drive the growth and drive a level of collaboration. We encourage you to attend the event, to roll up your sleeves. Yep, some of your competitors will be in the room. Some of your prospective partners will be in the room. Everest Group is inviting other consultancies and advisory companies to join the event. We want to have a discourse and networking and dialogue that is based upon better together and grow together for the benefit of our clients, and everybody wins. Curious, and as just before I turn it back to Abhishek and Ronak, they have been strategic partners and act as conference chairs in this event. And on the next slide, you'll hear a little bit on our next point of discussion, some of the key forces that are shaping opportunity or challenge across technology and tech services industries. I'm just curious, Abhishek and Ronak, as you think about what Elevate can do to bring some of the strategies to either counter negative or challenging forces and accelerate or bolster opportunistic forces. Just curious of how the experience of building the agenda and some of this thought has been as you've been engaged in this. I'll put that over to you, Abhishek, as I turn to you for the next slide.
Sure. I'm just wondering at this stage. I know I'm going to talk a bit about the 5 forces which are shaping enterprise technology and services in 2025 and beyond. But at the same time, I'm very much cognizant of the dynamic world that we live in. And one of the circumspection pieces that I always have in mind is sitting here today on June 11th, what I'm talking about, how we will look like in comparison to today when we meet in September 10th, how some of these things will shape. So my request to the audience is, one of the things that we will definitely be doing is, as we talk through some of these forces, we will also be keeping a close track of how these evolve. So when you see us in September, you'll probably see a much more nuanced version of how these forces have evolved. And with that, I'll jump into what we are going to tee up here as regards the forces. Let me outline the 5 and before going into the details. First is all about infusing agents into core operations of enterprises. And we'll come to what we really mean by that. But as you can see, we have teed it up with a topic focused on artificial intelligence and the much hyped topic of agents also. Second, it's about the growth opportunity. How do we really expand the total addressable market by addressing all enterprise operating expenditure and not just the IT spend? Hold on to that thought. We'll come to that later. Then we will talk about accelerating to value using the ecosystem that you work with. If you are a tech vendor, how do you work with service providers? If you are a tech vendor and a service provider, how do you work with the global services or the shared services side of the enterprises? There are so many startups also coming into the world. How do you work with the entire ecosystem to ensure value is actually created? And that is what will lead us to the fourth force, which is about growing base accounts, the clients that you engage with, through value-driven partnerships. How do you create value there? And then last but not the least, we will be dealing with a tactical topic of funding modernization through growth acceleration. So the key point to remember here is that these 5 forces are not just trends. They are priorities for you to be focusing on as you navigate the remainder of the year and 2026, which is coming up pretty soon. Each one is likely to open up a path to revenue, relevance, and resilience for you, especially in a world shaped by AI, automation, and platform-led services. So let's start with the first one because I teed it up. I'm pretty sure that has raised a lot of curiosity. Let's move to the next slide. Yes. So here is what we are going to talk about when it comes to distinct pathways which AI enterprises deploy when it comes to AI. What you're looking at here is not necessarily an evolution model. Please remember this, these are very distinct pathways that organizations deploy when they think of artificial intelligence within their setting. The first one is individual or bring your own AI, which probably most of you have seen it within your organizations and the organizations that you work with. In this case, in this scenario, organizations allow employees to use tools like ChatGPT, Notion AI, and others within a governed framework. The goal, by the way, is not experimentation for its own sake. It is to drive measurable productivity gains, accelerate task completion, and build a workforce that continues to evolve in the usage of AI. Because, as I said, we are all living in an AI-driven world. And if your employees, the folks who create value for your customers, if they are not adept at AI, your organization will not be prepared enough to compete in the broader setting. So that's the first pathway. The second pathway is the tech stack AI. This is about supercharging your enterprise tech. Here, enterprises will rely on, or rather, they already rely on AI embedded into their platforms like CRM, ERP, HR systems, collaboration systems. I mean, you can see some of the names that are mentioned here, whether it's Microsoft, Salesforce, which are part of your installed base. The focus here is on improving process efficiency inside the tools employees already use, which is to drive simplification of workflows and enhancing user experience across these functions and tech stacks where some of these technologies are deployed. The last but not the least is the systems of execution, which Ronak so thankfully teed up when he was talking about the themes that we ought to be caring about. This is all about autonomizing the enterprise. So if the first one, individual, was about amplifying humans within your organizational setup, if the second one was about supercharging enterprise tech, this is about autonomizing the entire enterprise. In this path, The focus or the goal of the organization is to deliver autonomy through AI, or as we are noticing, agents, where AI agents don't just support tasks, which is more applicable in the individual or the tech stack AI, they take over multi-step workflows. They agentify systems of record and systems of engagement and begin to rewire how work is executed across the business. So what you should be taking away from this slide here is that each pathway that you see here is not really just a reflection of maturity of enterprises. This is about the distinct goals which you see at the bottom of the slide, aligned to which how enterprises are thinking of which right pathway to pick. An enterprise could be present across all, implementing AI across all the three pathways. They could be going deeper into one pathway versus other, or as we are noticing, or as we are actually evangelizing it, systems of execution is where we see maximum value coming out of it. But then we'll come to that question of how, and you should be thinking about it in later slides. Last point to remember on this slide is all three will coexist. However, we'll see how systems of execution actually creates greater opportunity for you. So let's look at the entire technology and enterprise spend landscape and try and understand what's really happening. This slide, and it's a busy slide, I don't expect you to read and understand all that is there, but I'll give you the key messages that are there. This slide reframes how we think about the total addressable market for enterprise tech services. Currently, the market that you play in, which is the enterprise IT services market, represents just 3.5 to 4%. I mean, you can even expand that range. In certain industries, it's even lower. Certain industries, advanced industries, high tech, banking, etc., it can go even further north of 4 or 5%. But that's the range or the addressable market that you operate in. But when we start looking at the enterprise operating expenditure overall, when we are talking about all the operating costs that enterprises deliver, whether it's not only IT, it's R&D, it's delivery operations, other aspects of the enterprise, many of which have been under-automated, have never seen technology deployed, that's where the market significantly expands. What you should take away here is also the fact that expanding into OpEx is not just about stretching existing offerings. It's about designing for where enterprise work actually happens. And that's why let's look at how this OpEx opportunity breaks down onto the next slide. In many ways, I have explain myself or explain this slide in the previous slide itself, but I put this slide here just to repeat myself and showcase the massive difference in opportunity between traditional IT or enterprise IT and the broader OpEx base. Enterprise IT and tech services, which we here are calling the EITTS, makes up a small fraction, which we talked about being just between 3.5 to 4%. The rest sits in enterprise OpEx, functions and workflows and organizational processes that run the business, but have seen limited technology adoption or automation till now. What you should take away is this: the system of execution opportunity that we teed up 2 slides back, the opportunity there lies in bringing AI into those unaddressed areas or under-addressed areas where agents can bring in more autonomy and not just talk about assistance or support. So with that, what we have done is covered the first 2 forces. First one was about infusing agents into operation. And with that, we leaned into where those agents could play a role. So we talked about the expanded TAM that we will be able to address. The third force is all about accelerating value through the partner ecosystem, because as we are trying to address this market, you are not going to do it alone. But I will not steal away the limelight from what Ronak is going to talk about. Ronak, over to you to take us through how ecosystem can actually help unlock this TAM.
Yeah. So if you look at the next slide, again, yeah, this is the one. It's interesting, right? Because Abhishek, when you spoke about systems of execution, my thoughts always goes in the direction that this is a process-first conversation. Enterprises are looking to drive process outcomes. They want to use all the technologies, including AI, in those processes and drive that, right? And again, we have seen cycles of this, right? These process outcomes were driven through automation, right? Analytics, through cloud, right? Again, these could be multiple use cases for different technologies, and now they are for agentic AI and generative AI. But I think what's important is there's a huge ecosystem of technology providers, tech services providers who are coming together and into the enterprise and trying to solve this, which means that there are value that is getting created across components of this ecosystem, and all of them come together, and if rightly placed in a beautiful mosaic, they can create significant value. And that for me is where I see this to be a very powerful piece is, hey, how do you bring the ecosystem together? And I know, Mark, you are bringing the ecosystem together at Elevate. How are you seeing that kind of shape up, and what's the value for our attendees as well?
Yeah, there's a great, you mentioned it, as we look at a lot of the brands and logos on this slide, Ronak. We have a session led by Jason Kelly at IBM, focused on partner ecosystem. We'll be joined by a couple of other great leaders from the partner and channel spaces, really focus and drilling in on the sort of collective, the collective better together opportunity. I can see 4, 5, 6 logos that will be on stage at the event, sort of talking about this ecosystem opportunity.
That is amazing, right? And if you move to the next slide, right, because you want to talk about all the forces also, the other piece is the value that gets created along with the ecosystem, specifically for emerging technologies. I think it becomes very critical to understand how do they impact their processes, their OKRs, and how do we drive outcomes towards that. Most of the clients that I work with, they care a lot about driving velocity of change, wanting to work with an ecosystem that is looking at driving innovation into their context and bringing that expertise and shaping this up. And I think that is my big message to all of you out here is, hey, how do you come together using these new models in these emerging technologies in the client context and process becomes very critical, right? And talking about value, right? And again, that's the more, I think that's the crux of what we want to talk about is, Abhishek, I think you have a poll for us, and do you want to talk about value for us?
Yeah, I am. Let's launch the poll. The idea here is to understand if we are going to talk about value realization, let's understand it from the perspective of the pitches that you create in trying to articulate, deliver, or maximize value. So the question here is, in which area do technology and service providers face the greatest challenges in their AI pitches? Is it in value articulation? Is it the pathway that they create in the roadmaps or solutions that you create towards value realization? Or is it about the value that you're creating, but how to maximize that value? Is that the most challenging part? Or is it about business value delivery beyond the technology and services, which is your standard moat, which is where which is the table stakes play that you have had for years as you are trying to transform in a world which is changing, as we were discussing in the themes also. How do you do that? So as I'm looking at the results that are coming in so far, it's pretty much a very balanced group here in terms of the kind of challenges that they have identified or associated themselves with. I think since we are at the 1 minute mark, I'll end the poll and let's take a look at. Oh, interestingly, it's kind of even Stevens between value articulation, value realization, and value maximization, which I'm not surprised by, because depending on what you see in your base accounts, especially with customers who you have been dealing with, this question around these 3 pathways always pops up. But let's dive a bit deeper into this to understand how this works and how this particular force that we talked about, which is in relation to value realization, plays out. Ronak, why don't you take us through that?
And again, Abhishek, as I was reflecting on the results of the poll, I think we needed to have an all of the above kind of a conversation. And I think that is what I wanted to say. It is not one of this, it is all of the above. You need help to articulate the value in the customer context, in the stakeholder context, right? So I work with several technology providers, services providers. One question that I keep getting is, hey, we struggle to create value or articulate this value for procurement leaders, right? And again, if you really want to understand how to work with procurement leaders, Mark has a session at Elevate just about that, which is what is the value that procurement leaders cares about. We have a similar session on what do IT leaders cares about, and so on and so forth. So each stakeholder in their personas, we have sessions which are designed around what value do they care about and how do you articulate in a language they understand. But we don't stop at articulating the value. It is all about how do you then bring the ecosystem together to realize and deliver that value, maximize that value, and then not just talk about the value that our technology and services deliver, but also the value which is beyond that, right? And one good example is AI, right? When we talk about AI, one of the big challenges that we keep hearing is, hey, we have great AI POCs and tools that are getting into deployment, but the adoption has been challenging. The reason the adoption has been challenging is it's not a technology issue, but it's a cultural change management issue. So we need help to kind of drive adoption. We need help to kind of make use of these technologies and drive process changes, mindset changes. So when we talk about mindset, tool sets, skill sets, and what are the changes that are needed or the shifts that are needed across all of this is what we want to talk about at Elevate this year, right? So again, very excited about what all we have, and I know we're just teasing these ideas, but we're going to build this up as we come to the event out here. The other fourth, I think, which is also important, and I think Abhishek, you teed it up, so I want to talk about it on the next slide. And what I did is I kind of looked at data from two providers out here, and I kind of cleaned it up so that we're not naming providers out here, but I think the message is more important. We looked at two providers, and we looked at how they've been growing over the last few quarters. And then I started to drive correlation between what were the reasons that they were driving growth. And what was interesting is provider A, which was having much higher growth, which is in the green, one of the core reasons that they were doing really well is they were growing in their existing accounts. It seems simple, but again, it's so powerful as a thought process is if you are not growing in your existing account, if the base account growth playbook is not defined and not activated, we do see this challenge come in, right? And that's what we want to talk about at Elevate this year, which is what is the playbook to defend, right? Which is what we already have as wallet share in our clients. How do we take wallet share from others, and then how do we make new stuff, right? And how do we kind of grow all of this? So that is where we want to spend time and talk to you about when we are at Elevate. So this is very important in terms of thinking through base account growth and how that kind of creates a very important piece. Because as we look at enterprises, they definitely have a point of view on who they want to work with, how they want to work with, and they have their priorities cut out for the year. And Abhishek, I thought you wanted to share some data around how are we seeing that recalibration playing out.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move to the next slide. And before I tee up my narrative for this slide, what I would like to add to Ronak's point here is growth in your existing accounts or even in your top accounts is a lot about understanding and peeling what is really high priority in terms of the signals that you're getting. How do you understand the enterprise mindset is a very important aspect of it. And that is what we will be doing a lot at Elevate. What this slide here showcases is portion of how we will help you understand some of the mindset shifts that are taking place at enterprises. Like as this chart shows, what it is essentially showing is how to understand how enterprises are rethinking their provider relationships. And as you can see in the data, only 15% of enterprises expect to keep their provider mix unchanged in 2025. The majority either plan to rebalance work across providers or bring in new ones. This tells us one thing: enterprises are actively looking for differentiated value from their partners. And that is why the takeaway here is pretty much clear. Protecting your base accounts is less about defending renewals. Yes, I mean, most of the data that we are seeing here, at least from a TCV perspective, I think that is happening. But when we are peeling the onion, in terms of, hey, how it is expanding in terms of ACV, how new scope gets added, how you're adding new stakeholders, there is a lot more that is needed. And what we're noticing is that it is a lot about how you show up with modernization value, AI capabilities, which you are implementing yourself and are then bringing it in front of customers. So almost treating yourself as customer zero and then bringing it in the customer environment, and outcome ownership, which we have talked about for years. But now in the agentic world, it is coming closer to reality as regards how that might play out. So let's launch a poll here to help you understand, because we have a few folks joining from the enterprise side also, but also get your opinion around how do you see, or what is your understanding of the mindset when it comes to funding modernization budgets, which by the way is the last and the next force that we will be talking about. So the question here is, how are you or enterprises funding modernization budgets? Is it about multi-year capex approved by board? Is it about cost savings and efficiency, creating self-funding mechanism? Is it about vendor or expecting vendors to fund modernization in exchange of a longer-term deal with outcome or output-based transactions? Is it about selling assets or businesses to fund modernization? Or is it all of the above or none of the above? Maybe you're not capturing all the scenarios. So let's take a look at, okay, how is it playing out? Interesting. There is a kind of a race between the cost savings and all of the above. That definitely seems to be the case. I don't think any of your, I mean, at least the poll results till now showcase that any of our participants or audience has seen multi-year capex or vendor funds modernization. I think that scenario hasn't played out. But as we go deeper into some of these aspects at Elevate and bring you perspectives, you will see a lot more of that. So let me end the poll here, and so that you can also take a look at the results. This is very interesting. Ronak, what are your reflections, and why don't you take us through the last but so much more important force? You're on mute.
But it's interesting because the cost savings and efficiency creating self-funding mechanism is the largest one. And I was hoping that would be the answer, because it allows me to make my point on the next slide as we kind of close the poll. Here is most of the funding mechanics that we have seen in the past have all been about, hey, how do you drive savings-led modernization, right? So which is all about efficiency, cost takeouts, and all of those. But we're increasingly seeing, specifically, again, Abhishek, as you spoke about systems of execution and driving that change at scale and eating up into the entire operations OpEx, there is a growth-led advantage that you also want to bake in terms of driving the modernization spend. And this growth-led is about, does it allow me to launch new products? Does it allow me to tap into new customers? Does it allows me to create more value or create new experiences, create new monetization models? I think those are the areas which we believe are going to be important to create the funding case or the business case for modernization, because modernization, which is just stuck on the cost and efficiency plays, is not something that we believe is going to create that kind of an expanded TAM that we are looking out here. So continuous innovation approach and not a one-time cost savings approach is important. And we want to talk a lot about that as we go along out here, but also at the event. So Mark, I know you have a surprise offer for all of our attendees today. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Ronak. I almost started talking on mute. It wouldn't be a live meeting without it. Well, on our next slide, we do have a commercial offer, as I put my marketer's hat on. Elevate is a launch event. We are excited about the opportunity to bring all of the content and really focused, actionable counsel and actionable tactics that anybody in the revenue ecosystem can put to bear in your organizations to help, again, help your growth trajectory. But to help you get there, as a webinar participant on this discussion today, take a look at the link in the chat. Submit your key takeaway from what Abhishek, Ronak, or maybe even I have shared with you from today's webinar. Do so by the end of the day, Friday the 13th. And you have the opportunity to win one of 5 passes that we are giving away to attend Elevate in September in Dallas. The agenda is optimized for team attendance. It is optimized for a bunch of different roles, as you've heard Abhishek and Ronak talking on the different stakeholders from tech and service providers that should be focused on the macro forces that they're talking about. But most importantly, from my perspective, that our data on the planned or intended churn and service provider and partner mix from our enterprise, from the enterprise respondents, is an important one, an important reason to be at Elevate. Understand how you can, as Ronak said, make, take, or defend additional opportunity across your businesses. We'd love to see you at Elevate. Give your feedback on what a key takeaway was from this webinar, and we will communicate to all the webinar participants who the lucky winners are at the end of no later than 30 June. With that, one more key on the next slide. We've got one more discussion point from Ronak and Abhishek. So without further ado, we'll turn it back to Ronak for some points on shaping and winning deals.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you, Mark, and Abhishek and I will kind of talk about this. But this one was interesting, right? Because we spent some time understanding several deals and kind of going through what has been the key win themes and what have been the key loss themes, and trying to put together in one page, right? So if you look at from a win themes perspective, what do best-in-class level win rates look like, right? As I said, right, clear articulation of value, which is realistic, pragmatic, right? Focusing on the commercial impact and timelines. I think it's very important. So what are you going to do? How are you going to do? How much it's going to cost? And what's the real value that you can bring? It has to be competitive, because this is a market where we saw all the macro challenges, economic challenges. So you have to be competitive in your total cost of operations, total cost of value, total cost of technology. How do you drive that? How do you make sure that your differentiators are not something which are generic, but are very context specific to the ask, to the client, and the domain that they care about? And more importantly, how are you understanding the client pain points, bringing the empathy, using the consultative thought leadership to inspire trust? Because a lot of pitches are great on paper in terms of the responses, say RFP responses to client pitches, but they don't bring the trust, right? They don't bring the long-term investment that clients are looking for. And that's where it's very, very important to kind of bring that. And the last but not the least is, okay, how do you bring a theme around transformation, right? We spoke about systems of execution, bringing agents into operations, talked about growth-led funding for modernization. How do you actually actualize this and bring it together is going to be important. And what have been the challenges for low win rates, right? So everything from the antithesis of not being able to articulate the value, right? So poor articulation of value, not being able to give the journey or the roadmap of how the transformation will look like. If you're not very competitive when it comes to the commercials and the total cost of operations, right? Because we've seen cases where there has been request to invest significantly in one component, which creates an over-indexed pain point in the other. So the balanced solutions are needed. So that becomes important. In some cases, it's also about using boilerplate slides, right? So these are like existing artifacts which has nothing to do with the client situations and getting pitched in sales meetings, in RFP responses. All of those are not the right ones, right? And currently we are seeing the same play out in a lot of GCC deals, right? As we are looking at the build, operate, transfer, or assisted setup of GCCs, one thing that we are seeing is folks are using their standard philosophy on outsourcing and not kind of understanding the unique context of what GCCs need to be able to talk about. And guess what? At Elevate, we're going to talk about what are these philosophies of GCC deals, what would make you successful in driving relevance to the client conversation on GCCs, we'll talk about. We also have a great session moderated by Nitish, which is going to be about how do you do this for mid-market clients, because our pitches for large enterprises versus mid-sized enterprises have to be different because their challenges are different, what they care about is different. So how do we bring about that? We have excellent workshops on commercial innovation, commercial structuring, which can help you with challenges around deal structuring, innovation in commercials. That's going to led by our commercial solutions and analytics leaders. That's going to be amazing. You cannot miss that workshop. So these are important themes that we are tracking when it comes to win and loss themes. And we're going to double down on a lot of these when we are at Elevate very soon. If we move to the next slide, what I also want to talk about is as we are designing the agenda for Elevate, there are a few fundamental truths that came to us and which were so simple but very hard hitting. And we want to talk about that, right? Because we've seen a lot of the differentiation that we talk about in today's days and age. A lot of that can be copied, replicated, imitated very quickly. But what stays and stands apart is the folks who execute, the folks who deliver value, the folks who come and stand and kind of build long-term relationships, the ones who are here to earn the trust. And I think that is where it requires us to go back to basics. It allows us to bring our standard playbooks to life. And a lot of this is about being simple, but being simple is the hardest part, is what I've realized as we're kind of designing this agenda. And we want to talk a lot about all of these themes when we are at Elevate. But Abhishek, Mark, would love to get your thoughts also on this one.
The only thing that I will highlight here is that what you see here on this slide is in many ways the reflections of the mindsets that we hope technology and service providers would bring to table post Elevate. That's what we will help with. But how that will come about and transpire is how our agenda at Elevate, and Mark will probably touch upon that a bit, will give you the tool sets and the skill sets to be thinking through. We do acknowledge you are the practitioners. You have done this for decades. There are so many skill sets that you have developed, but the conference or Elevate specifically is an opportunity to bring about an exchange, some of these skill sets, network and understand what's working, what's not working, how things are evolving. And what will be different here is that it's not just about exchanging notes. We have done so much of research in these areas to understand and put together something which is what we can call benchmark and best in class, which we will kind of tee it up in front of you and then help you contextualize to your situations, your pursuits, your accounts. That's what we will hopefully be able to do for you. Mark, is that a good reflection or summarization of what we can accomplish?
It's great. It's also, while we're looking at this slide, Ronak teed up a couple of the sessions specifically that wrap around these five sort of elements on the outside of the semicircle here. But the most important one, to the point you just made, Abhishek, from my standpoint, is there are many seasoned, well-experienced executives that will be in attendance at the event. But what the event will do also is put the customer at the center, right? Like we've got trust here, change trust for customer. And as we all collectively with this conference give you the tools, the tactics, the actions to really implement scalable, sustainable growth in the macro pressures that you talked about in the new technology, the new macro environments and things like that. By putting this customer at the center of the conference, from our perspective, everyone ups their game. And when the customer benefits, we all benefit. from a go-to-market perspective. Let's with that, I think we do have a couple more minutes for on the next slide. We're actually going to jump to the final slide for Q&A. Moderator might have some things here. We have seen a couple questions come in, but from my perspective, before I give it back to Ronak and Abhishek, please do not hesitate to reach out to any of us to ask about Elevate, but also to ask about the data points that Ronak and Abhishek teased. We did it on purpose, right? We want you to come to the conference to get the full playbooks on some of the insight and information that we have. And I think that's enough talk from me. Ronak, Abhishek, not sure if you guys have anything else.
Yeah, there is one question that I hope, Ronak, if you could address it. The question goes something like this. Actually, it's related to one of the polls that we launched. It says one of the poll options was vendor-funded modernization. The question is, how realistic is that as a model? And in what kind of deals does it actually work?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. So what we are seeing is there are certain processes where we can drive transformation, not just for one client, but we can do this in a multi-tenant or a utility model for several clients, right? So think of these as activities that most enterprises need to do in, say, a particular industry, right? Say these are regulatory activities, checks and balances, some data work, some processing work, which is not very driving a lot of competitive advantage, but it's more of a cost of doing business, which can get automated using everything that we spoke about with systems of execution. And you can become that systems of execution partner for your client in one area. So what you now do is you take pieces of technology that already exists in, say, a client or a group of clients, drive modernization, put the money in to be able to take that new systems of execution pitch to multiple clients. In the old days, we used to call this as like business process as a service or a utility-based platform. Right now, this can become massive systems of execution playbooks that you could do, right? Client is using an old platform to manage, say, healthcare administration, right? And a lot of these administration can be taken over, or if it is in the insurance space, there's a lot of claims processes which require multi-party coordination. Could we address that? Things around fraud and abuse, things around compliance. A lot of those use cases is where we believe the vendor can come in and invest, because you are building assets that you can monetize by investing in the early modernization and creating a systems of execution model.
Great. I don't think we have time for any more questions. We just hit the top of the hour. So I'll hand it over to the moderator to help us close it out.